Well, believe it or not, this is our final lesson in our Maseroth study, the study of the story of God. And the next several lessons will be covering Leo the lion. And throughout this series, I've used the analogy of how writers craft a good story, suggesting when we started in the beginning that we look at the story of God in much the same way, right? Look at how God breaks a story down into different acts with different chapters. Now, of course, that's my own mind trying to organize a very large story. I'm not saying that the Bible says Act 1, Chapter 1, but I think you get the analogy. And it's hard to believe it's been a year, considering that we started with the creation week as the prologue of Chapter 1. We are now going into Acts, not Acts chapter 5, but the fifth act of the story of God. And it's amazing to think that we literally have spent a year and we've gone through the prologue and Acts 1, Act 2, 3, and 4, etc. Of course, Act chapter 5, I did it again. The fifth act of the story of God, probably a better way to say it, began with cancer, right? The tribulation, the Antichrist, the place of safety. And it ends with this final sign, Leo the lion. And I want to show you the morning sky. This is typically what the sky looks like in the east in the middle of August. You can see that the sun has left the constellation of Cancer and is just entering the constellation of Leo. And as the next 5 or 6 weeks progresses, each morning when the sun rises, the sun will appear to be further and further down through the constellation of Leo until at the beginning of next year, with around Rosh Hashanah, the sun will rise above the constellation of Virgo, and the story will start to tell itself all over again. Now, what I want to do is I want to ground ourselves in the scripture or scriptures that links a lion to the story of God. And we're going to come about this through a little bit of a roundabout way. We're just going to make that link, and then we're going to start telling some backstory. So I want you to take your Bible and go to Genesis 49. Genesis 49. And this is, I think, in our ministry, a fairly well-known chapter, especially with our understanding of how pivotal the Abrahamic covenant is to the entire story of God and bringing about the Messiah. Genesis 49, of course, is the prophetic chapter where Jacob is on his deathbed and he's pronouncing prophecies over each of his different sons. And when he gets in verse 8, Genesis 49:8, he gets to Judah. He says, Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your children's or your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion who shall rouse him. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from beneath his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. The Septuagint says the expectation of the nations. Binding his donkey to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, he washed his garments in wine, and his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. Now, there's a lot of stuff to talk about here, and we'll eventually get to picking apart most of the elements that we see here in Genesis 49, 8 through 12. But here's my first question. This is what I want to deal with today is, why did the line or the lineage that led to Messiah, why did that fall to Jacob? I'm sorry, why did that fall to Judah? Right? And if you've looked at the birth order, I'm sure none of us have committed the birth order of Jacob's 12 sons to memory, but I think it's worthwhile going back to look at that. You know, asking simple questions like, why Judah? Who was Judah's mother? Where did Judah fall in the birth order of all the 12 tribes of Israel? Well, his mother was a woman named Leah. She was one of two sisters that was married to Jacob. He was actually the fourth in birth order, and he was preceded by his three older brothers who were Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. So here's a schematic that breaks that down and shows Jacob's heritage. And you can read about all of this in Genesis chapter 35. We're not going to go through that, but again, this is pretty easy to find if you know the right place to look. So the question that we're going to wrestle with today is, why did the line of Messiah fall to Judah when there were so many different sons of Jacob that God could have chosen? Why Judah? I think it's a legitimate question, and I think there is a specific answer, or perhaps some interrelated answers that we'll discover as we go through. So what we've seen throughout the Bible is this concept of the younger exceeding the elder, right? The second born taking place of the firstborn, like Cain and Abel, or Ishmael and Isaac, and of course the story of Jacob and Esau, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But Jacob was the fourth in line. He wasn't the second, and he certainly wasn't the first. So why would God pass over Jacob's first three sons, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, to favor the fourth son? And this brings up another question, right? Did Judah do something to earn that particular favor? Or did the Father in his omniscience look forward in time to see through which of Jacob's sons a man like David would come? And did he choose Judah for no reason other than he could see the future and knew that's where David would end up? And I don't think that is the answer particularly. That's my opinion. But, I think there is maybe an obvious, perhaps a surface explanation, which I think holds some merit, but it doesn't capture the entire answer. For example, in Genesis 35:22, it says that after Rachel died, and Rachel was the mother of Joseph and Benjamin, after Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin, that the adult Reuben, and this is a quote, went into and lay with his father's concubine Bilhah. And Bilhah would have been, probably, if you do some simple math, maybe 12 to 15 years older than Reuben was. But more importantly, Bilhah was actually Jacob's wife. Even though she was a handmaid, she was given to Jacob to be a wife to be able to bear sons in the name of Rachel. And again, we'll see a little bit of that story coming up, right? In Genesis 34, both Simeon and Levi murdered an entire family of Shechemites because the local prince of Shechem was in love with their sister Dinah, and Dinah and this prince were intimate without having been married, and this was considered defiling her. And so Simeon and Levi went in and literally murdered pretty much a whole town, kind of convinced them all to get circumcised that they could marry into the family, so to speak. That was a requirement. But when they were recovering from their circumcision, the two men went in and killed everybody. But is that any reason to not favor them, right? The mistakes of Reuben and Simeon and Levi, or maybe a better way to ask is that if God glossed over the first three brothers to choose Judah, was Judah that much of a better person than Reuben was? Or perhaps was he better than Simeon and Levi? Or maybe even Jacob himself, for that matter, because Jacob certainly wasn't perfect. Well, go to Genesis chapter 49. I just want to show you a couple of things and kind of relate some big picture concepts as we start to develop an understanding of what I think, at least my understanding of what God is doing. So Genesis 49, verse 3, this is going backwards where we were. Now we're still in that prophetic chapter, right? It says, Reuben, you are my firstborn. Genesis 49:3. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, the excellence of dignity and the excellency of power. Unstable as water, you shall not excel, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it, he went up to my couch, right? So we understand that Reuben goes in and he has intimacy with Bilhah, who started out as a maidservant but became a wife of Jacob. And here's the big question, like which of the 10 commandments did Reuben transgress? Right? Certainly would be considered adultery because he slept with another man's woman. He didn't honor his father in sleeping with his wife. Now, obviously, Bilhah was not Reuben's mother, so that obviously would be incest. So we have adultery, we have not honoring his father, and maybe we can even throw in there covetousness, because chances are there was some a lead up time period where there was some attraction and maybe some enticing, and then all of a sudden Reuben lies with Bilhah, right? So we know that he transgressed several of the 10 commandments. Now, we haven't gone through this in our local fellowship with our group from Tampa and scattered around, but we'll probably eventually get to all of this. But it's an interesting comment to note that the 10 commandments likely represent a set of rules that God had given to all mankind before the law was given to Mount Sinai. And it's, one of the arguments that I think really supports that is the fact that the Ten Commandments were written in stone, while the other 603 commandments that comprise the law, or laws, let's call it that comprise the Mosaic Law, were not written in stone, but they were written in a book. But nevertheless, we have come to a position where we believe that the Ten Commandments superseded the law, they predated the law, and they were God's statutes and commands, those things that Abraham was obeying, that was involved in God choosing Abraham to give his promises in his covenant. So Reuben transgressed several of these laws, which would have been in place when all of this happened. Now go verse 5, let's continue on. This is Simeon and Levi. Simeon and Levi are brothers, instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. Let not my soul enter their council, let not my honor be united to their assembly. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they hamstrung an ox. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. And I pointed out in lessons before that this was a prophecy that came true. We know that Simeon was, their tribe dwindled and eventually were absorbed into the tribe of Judah. And then, of course, the Levites became the priests, and they didn't own land, yet they had cities in the land of other tribes that were scattered throughout the entire land that God had promised to Abraham. Now, did Simeon and Levi also transgress some commandments? I mean, at the very least, they committed murder. They killed people who were innocent, right? So in the cases of both Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, we can say that maybe one of the reasons why God passed them over was because of the heinous things that they did throughout their adult life. Well, what about Jacob? Well, listen, he we'll see the story coming out, because I think there's some very interesting points to come out of looking at that particular story as we seek to answer the question, why Judah? Jacob certainly didn't honor his father Isaac when he deceived him into receiving the blessing that was theoretically supposed to go to Esau. In verse 8, when God speaks through Jacob about Judah, he switches in the Hebrew Old Testament, he switches into the future. And he says, Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, and your father's children shall bow down before you. Now, by the time that Jacob utters these words in Genesis 49, God had already chosen Judah, right? Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, they kind of seem to have been disqualified, at least maybe for the magnitude of their personal transgressions. And that's not to say that these men, didn't straighten up personally or, do good later in life. Obviously, the tribe of Levi was blessed at some point with the responsibilities of driving the priesthood. Another couple of examples. Reuben, for example, tried to stop his brothers from killing Joseph by convincing them to throw him in a pit with the intent of going back later to rescue him and restoring him to his father. Yet in the same story, Judah, through whom the Messiah would come, wasn't satisfied with just throwing him in a pit. He wanted to profit by not allowing Joseph to die, but by selling him to slave traders and getting some money, which they did while Reuben was gone. And but that action ultimately saved all 12 tribes of Israel, because it was God who brought them into Egypt and brought them favor through Joseph with Pharaoh and allowed them to be sustained through the 7 years of famine that was predicted as a result of Pharaoh's dream, right? So when we start making decisions or assessments about, God chose this person over this one because this person was better than someone else, the reality is it's quite a mixed bag. We have good people doing bad things and bad people doing good things, and people who do bad things early on in life doing better but still doing bad things later down the road. And so I don't know that we can quite claim that the reason why Judah was chosen over his three older brothers was because he was morally more upright or tended to do more good. I don't think that that's the reason why at all. And so I think that we have to dig a little bit deeper. So let's go to Genesis chapter 25. Genesis 25. So if we're dealing with the question, why Judah, I think we have to struggle with questions like, why Jacob? Why Isaac? We know why God chose Abraham, right? Abraham believed God, he trusted him, was counted for righteousness. So what about Isaac, right? Before he was born, God prophesied Isaac's miraculous birth, and he did that a year before Isaac was born. This was about 13 years before Ishmael was born, and maybe 14 years or so after God had promised Abraham that he would produce an heir from his own body. Because if you remember the story, at one point Abraham lamented, how is anyone going to inherit anything, because I don't have an heir, and the only heir is a servant in my home. And God said, don't worry, I'm going to provide the heir for you. So why did God choose Isaac? He was demonstrating his sovereignty, and he was demonstrating his control over, say, the reproductive process. Sarah was barren. Abraham and Sarah were both very old people. And by doing things a certain way with Isaac, he made it absolutely clear that Isaac was the child of promise. Well, why did God choose Jacob, right? He chose Abraham because of his faithfulness and because of his obedience. He chose Isaac because he established Isaac in the womb of Sarah. What about Jacob? Well, in Genesis 25:19, let's take a look at that. It says, this is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Paddan Aram. And this was Rebekah being the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, right? Barren just like Sarah was. And the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah his wife conceived. But the children struggled within her. And she said, if all is well, why am I like this? So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other. And here's the pattern, right? The older shall serve the younger. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau, which basically means hairy. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob, which means supplanter. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So what's the big question again, right? Why Judah? And in answering that, we have to ask questions like, why Jacob? Well, when he was in his mother's womb, I'm sorry, not why. The question is, when did God choose Jacob? The answer is when he was in his mother's womb, and maybe perhaps even before that, obviously in his foresight, right? The important element here is that the twins struggled in the womb and they were at odds from the beginning. Now I want to take a little bit of a detour here for a second and ask a question. Have you ever wondered whether or not Jacob and Esau were identical paternal twins or non-identical fraternal twins? And the difference between the two is where paternal twins that are genetically identical, they look the same, they sound the same. This is where you have 2 babies that come from a fertilized egg that splits, right? There's a single egg that results in 2 babies. And then there is what are called fraternal, FRA, fraternal twins, which are non-identical, and that's where you have 2 eggs that were fertilized at the same time, right? So you have 1 egg per each baby in fraternal. And so, for example, fraternal twins don't have to look the same. They could be a boy and a girl, whereas with identical paternal twins, where there's 1 egg that divides, they are identical in every way, and they'll both be boys or both be girls. Now, I found a very interesting journal article. This was from the South African Journal of Medicine back in 1997. It was a Jewish author, and he was posing this very question, and whether or not Jacob and Esau were identical or non-identical twins. And he reviewed several different scholarly opinions, which seemed to be split. Even as far back as the 12th century, Jewish rabbis were asking the same question: what kind of twins were they? Those who favor the fraternal non-identical twins, point to differences in their their appearance and their predisposition. Right? Esau was red and hairy. Jacob was smooth-skinned. Esau was a hunter and an outdoorsman. Jacob was more mild-mannered and lived at home, and Esau seemed to be prone to impulses of anger, and Jacob seemed to be, maybe a little bit more cerebral, perhaps a little bit more calculating. But the author of this article points out that with fraternal twins, each have their own amniotic sac, kind of living like in their own little cocoon. And what that means is that when the Bible says that when Jacob was born, he was holding on to Esau's heel, that almost rules out having two different amniotic sacs, unless we have a situation where Jacob's amniotic sac had ruptured in the process of Esau's birth, so that Esau or Jacob was holding on to Esau's heel as he was born. So this implies the fact that the Bible states that Jacob was holding on to Esau's heel implies, but certainly doesn't guarantee, a single amniotic sac that they both were incubating in, if I can use that word. And that supports the idea that Jacob and Esau indeed were identical or paternal twins. But if so, how do we account for physical as well as personality differences that the Bible clearly describes? Well, this journal, remember, or this article is in a medical journal. It's a South African medical journal, and it's in a section called that was labeled the history of medicine. And the author points out that there's a condition among twins, and having twins is relatively rare, and statistically it was more rare many years ago, generations ago, than it is today. But even among twins, there's a not common condition called twin transfusion syndrome, where instead of a mother's blood flowing into like a single amniotic sac into both babies and then out from both babies directly into the mother's circulation, in this twin transfusion syndrome, blood comes into the babies, but the blood of one twin actually exits that body into the circulation of his or her twin and then out into the mother, right? And so one twin actually gets an abundance of blood supply, which seems to detract from the other ones. And the result of this twin transfusion syndrome is that one twin has a much higher volume of blood, many more red blood cells, which carries things like oxygen. These children tend to be redder, or they appear to be more red at birth, and they can be as much as 20% heavier and 20% bigger than the twin who has the lack of blood flow, right? The other twin tends to be smaller, lighter, paler, weaker, even anemic. Now, as they grow into adulthood, twins who were born under this circumstance, who come out looking radically different, as their bodies mature, the differences become less pronounced, and they start looking more and more like the identical twins they are as they get older. So in the beginning, especially at birth, they look radically different, but as adults, they tend to look very similar. So here we go now. It is very likely that Jacob and Esau were identical twins, but had this particular transfusion syndrome that affect their physical appearance, perhaps even their predisposition. But remember, the verse said that Isaac loved Esau and Rebekah loved Jacob. And in the Greek version, the Septuagint, this is the agape love that we've talked many times about before, where it's about esteeming someone above all else, usually for something that is inherent to that person or that thing that is being esteemed. So the question would be, why would Isaac esteem Esau over Jacob, and why would Rebekah esteem Jacob over Esau? Well, I would propose that Isaac loved Esau because he was a hunter and he provided game. He was probably bigger, stronger, he was more aggressive, he was more manly, and on paper, if you will, he would probably seem to be the natural heir. Aside from being the firstborn, he was more of a man's man. At least that's the way I read the biblical description. And he was probably considered by Isaac to be a stronger heir to lead the family, and therefore a better heir to inherit the promises. But what about Rachel? Why would Rachel love Jacob more so? Well, it seems to me that maybe a mother would tend to cling to the weaker child, the weaker twin, who was more dependent on her for survival in the beginning, needed a lot more nurturing. Maybe there was more of a connection, a maternal connection that happened at that point. But here's a very interesting point. Aside from all of these, and these are obviously some degree of speculation, it's very interesting that God told her when she went to inquire about her condition, God told her that the younger would rule over the elder. Same pattern that we see with Cain and Abel, same thing that we saw with Isaac and Ishmael. And while God told her that the younger would rule the elder, in the biblical account, I don't see any indication that she actually shared that knowledge with either Isaac himself and certainly not with Esau. But I do believe that she did share it with Jacob. Let's continue on in verse 29. Now we're into adulthood now. It says, now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, please feed me with the same red stew, for I am weary. Therefore his name was called Edom, and Edom just means red. But Jacob said, sell me your birthright as of this day. Here he is negotiating, right? Maybe it's that calculating cerebral. Maybe in the back of his mind, he's thinking, this is my opportunity. It seems like my brother really doesn't care about the inheritance, and my mother told me this story about what God said to her, and maybe this is how I'm going to secure the birthright, is by negotiation. So he says, sell me your birthright as of this day. And Esau said, look, I'm about to die. What is this birthright to me? Then Jacob said, swear to me as of this day. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So, again, as these twins grow up, I can imagine that both Rebekah and Jacob are kind of sitting back, biding their time, knowing the prophecy of the Lord that the older would rule over the younger. But also knowing that as Isaac continues to age and continues to prefer Esau over Jacob, what's more interesting is that, in the two times that Jesus showed up to bless Isaac with the promises, not once did the pre-incarnate Christ, in speaking the Abrahamic covenant to Isaac, not once did he mention that he was supposed to bless the younger over the older, right? God shared that only with Rebekah, and I would think that she shared that only with Jacob. She didn't appear to share that with Isaac, and we can say that with good confidence that Isaac didn't know this because of what we read now in Genesis 27. So Genesis 27:1. Now it came to pass when Isaac was old and his eyes were so dim that he couldn't see, that he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, my son. And he answered and said, here I am. Then he said, behold, now I am old, I do not know the day of my death. Now therefore, please take your weapons, your quiver, and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and make me savory food, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. Now when he says that my soul may bless you before I die, he's talking about transferring. It's like that fatherly blessing that transfers the covenants from the father to the heir. Verse 5, now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to Esau his son, and Esau went to the field to hunt game and to bring it. So Rebekah spoke to Jacob her son, saying, indeed, I heard your father speak to Esau your brother, saying, bring me game and make savory food for me, that I may eat it and bless you in the presence of the Lord before my death. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice according to what I command you. And so it seems to me very clear that the expectation of both Isaac and Esau was that Esau would receive the blessing, he would receive the inheritance and the promises that are associated with the covenant. So now it's crunch time, right? Isaac is on his deathbed. It looks like he's going to transfer the inheritance to Esau, yet the Lord promised, or said, not promised, but said that what was going to happen with the twins was that the older would serve the younger. So Rebekah springs into action. She instructs Jacob to dress like his brother Esau, and she puts on like hairy goat skins on his arms and on the smooth part of his neck, and he goes in and he pretends to be Esau, and he feeds his father the same stew that his father had asked for. And, honestly, on the surface, this seems totally egregious, right? She instructs her preferred son to deceive his father into giving him the blessing that he would otherwise give to the son that he preferred, the one who was naturally the firstborn. And it seems all kind of wrong on the surface, except that's how God wanted it, and how he said it would be when he spoke to her in her pregnancy. He said, 2 nations are at war inside you. They will come out, they will struggle, but the older will serve the younger. Now, maybe I'm wrong. We're absolutely not told if this was simply Rebekah's idea in a moment of panic and maybe somehow reflected a lack of trust in God. God said it would happen, so why wouldn't she just let back and allow events to play out? We don't know if this was, again, her doing, or maybe she was instructed to do this, right? It's difficult, if not impossible, certainly not advised, to construct an argument based on silence. It doesn't say, so we don't know. We can speculate as long as we're honest about and transparent about the fact that we're speculating and show why we're speculating in a certain direction. Well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe God did tell Isaac the same thing about Jacob and Esau, and maybe Isaac was being disobedient. I don't know, maybe he had lost his mind in his judgment. Maybe Rebekah came in and saved the day through the deception. All we know is that God has given us example after example after example of how he uses the imperfect actions of imperfect people to bring about his will, to bring about circumstance and events that serve his plan. Even if the action that God takes is simply letting human nature take its course, knowing that Rebekah would do certain things, or Jacob would do certain things, or knowing that Esau would despise his birthright and actually sell it. Maybe in the end, maybe it didn't matter whether or not they tricked Isaac into blessing Jacob, because Esau had sold his birthright. Perhaps what would have happened under the law of that culture in that time was that maybe at his death, Isaac would have blessed Esau, but then Jacob would have presented his claim, saying, listen, you sold your birthright. It doesn't matter that our father blessed you. You've sold that birthright to me, and either way, God's will is done. We can sit and speculate, and sometimes it's fun to do that. Sometimes we can get ourselves into a little bit of trouble, but I think that it's very interesting to mull these things over in our mind. Now, at this point, you probably should be asking yourself, well, how does all of this relate to Judah? Well, it's all part of the backstory. It's all part of the patterns and setting up what turns out to be a break from the pattern in some way when we actually get to the story of the birth of Judah. Let's go to Genesis 28 right now. Genesis 28. And you might remember the story of Jacob and his marriage to the sisters Leah and Rachel. It's an extension and a continuation of the story of the struggle between Jacob and Esau. Because what ends up happening is that after Jacob takes advantage of his dying blind father and deceives him into thinking that he is his twin brother Esau, his mother Rebekah warns Jacob, who now holds the blessing. He warns him that Esau has found out what he has done, and he's out for blood. It literally says that he's going to find him and he's going to kill him. In Genesis 28, it's actually Isaac himself. Like Isaac at some point realizes that he's been deceived, but once the blessing is bestowed, the blessing was bestowed. And knowing that Esau was out for blood, it was Isaac himself who told Jacob to flee to find his uncle Laban, who was his mother's brother, Rebekah's brother, not only to escape Esau, but to find a wife for himself among family. And earlier in the story, we're told that Esau married 2 women. One was a Hittite, one was, I can't remember what other nation she belonged to, but Esau married outside of the family, and Rebekah is recording as saying it like, they're a pain in my side, right? She doesn't want that for her children, doesn't want that for the family. Well, on Jacob's journey, as he escaped from Esau, he journeys to find Laban. He lies down on a rock, and he has the dream that we refer to as Jacob's ladder, and that's where the pre-incarnate Christ himself reiterates this Abrahamic covenant to Jacob as an individual person, right? Despite what he had just done to be in a position to receive the Abrahamic blessing, God gives it to him anyways, which again, leads me back to a conclusion, partial speculation, that either God knew it was going to happen this way and he just let it happen because it served his will, or maybe he had a hand in pushing events and kind of pushing people into the natural inclination of their own decision making. But either way, God's will was done, and the younger was ruling over the elder. So what's interesting about this Jacob's ladder as we listen to God speaking the promises of Abraham to Jacob himself is that Moses doesn't record any chastisement. It's not like God says to Jacob, now listen, Jake, I don't like how this whole, lying to get the blessing business happened, but, since I had picked you anyways, let's just forget about it, just don't do it again. We don't see that kind of chastisement. We don't hear it at all. What we do hear is the exact same promises, plus the same kind of unilateral oath to fulfill the promise that God had given both to Abraham as well as to Isaac. So let's read in Genesis 28:12. Then he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to heaven, and there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants. So there's the land and the people. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south. And in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. So, one of the interesting points is that Jacob's deception of his father, betrayal of his brother, didn't deter the Lord from using him as a conduit for the Abrahamic covenant, right? And who was it that first spoke the promise of the blessing of the inheritance to Jacob? It wasn't God. It was actually Isaac, right? Isaac spoke the blessing first, gave him his father's blessing, transferred the inheritance, if you will, and then God ratified it by swearing that unilateral oath that we see in verse 15. I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you, right? And God wouldn't have allowed that, wouldn't have done that if he thought Jacob to be unsuitable. It doesn't mean that Jacob was perfect, because we see over and over and over again God using imperfect people with imperfect actions to bring about his will. And that's probably an important lesson, right? As we ask questions like, what did God see in Jacob as he allowed all this to happen? Like, God has never looked for perfect obedience before he used people as his instrument of promise, an instrument of prophecy. Right? I think what we can say with a fair amount of confidence is that what God looks for is some kind of a track record as well as some kind of potential. And while Jacob did deal dishonestly with his father and his brother, what's most important about this story and why God would have chosen Jacob was the value that he placed on his inheritance that his brother did not. Right? If we can assume, based on some of the arguments that I presented, that Jacob and Esau were indeed genetically identical, what distinguished them was not just their physical appearance and stature or predisposition. It was really the perception of the value of the covenant that was given to their father and their grandma and their grandfather. It was really ultimately a difference of the heart, even if Jacob's heart was imperfect. Jacob esteemed the covenant, he loved the covenant, while Esau, direct quote, despised it. And that word, despised, whether you look at the Hebrew or the Greek, really utterly means to look at something as being worthless. We could translate that as hate, right? Just, there's no value. So what does Jacob do? He sets up an altar, he calls the place Bethel, and he vows to follow God and to give him a tenth of whatever it was that God blessed him with. Now, he is fleeing from Esau on threat of death. I don't think that he left his father's house and household with a whole bunch of servants with him and a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of... He probably had the clothes on his back and maybe some lentil stew in a pot that he threw over his shoulder. He didn't have much. He probably didn't have anything at all, hence sleeping in a field with his head on a rock. But when he says that when he vows to follow God, all he asked for was food and clothing and to return to his father's house in peace. And I think that has implications to understand where his heart was, even though he used deception as a means to get his father's blessing. If the only reason that Jacob wanted the inheritance was just simply authority, he just wanted to be the top dog, he wanted to stick it to his brother, if the only reason he wanted a power grab, don't you think that when he swore an oath to God and said, okay, if you do this for me, I'll follow you the rest of my life, I don't think he would have stopped simply with the bare necessities. Not at all. Well, Jacob continues his journey after he encounters God, right? So now he's had his father's blessing. Now the Lord himself shows up and says, yeah, I'm doing for you what I did for Isaac and what I did for Abraham. So he continues on, and he encounters his first cousin Rachel. They fall in love. She's the love of his life. He wants to marry her, but her father Laban, Jacob's uncle, demands 7 years of service as a herdsman before he will let her marry him. So while Jacob is laboring for 7 years, God's blessing is kind of spilling over on everyone in the neighborhood, and so Laban actually becomes a very wealthy man because God's favor is on Jacob, and Jacob is serving Laban so that he can marry Rachel. And I've always kind of often wondered why the 7-year waiting period. Can we connect it back to the creation week or the agricultural cycle? Maybe there's some connection there. Was it simply Laban's protective daddy complex and he just didn't really want his daughter to go? I mean, maybe he preferred Rachel over Leah, but I don't think the story supports that. Maybe as we learn in the story, he was hesitant to let Jacob go because he knew God's blessing was on him because Jacob was under his household. But, the more I think about it, the more I think the 7 years and the time that Jacob had to wait to marry was for Jacob's own benefit. And perhaps this was the chastisement that was coming for doing things the way he did. Again, we're not really told. We're given all these pieces kind of in a nebulous picture, and we do our best to fit them together in ways that make sense, that don't, offend rules of logic and common sense and the character and the nature of God. But as the story unfolds, we learn that not only does he wait 7 years, he has to wait a total of 20 years, right? 7 years before he can marry. Then after he marries, he has to stay for another 7 years, and then there's another 6 years before he can actually pack up and go home. And so here we have the current heir of the promise, right? And don't underestimate the value of what that means. Like, how important is it to say, I am the heir of the promise? And he's unable to live in peace with his family, right? His brother, his mother. He's desperately in love with Rachel, a woman that he can't have. And he's working for a man who abuses him from a labor standpoint, because several times in the story we hear about how Laban changes his wages 10 times and he treats him very unfairly. Right? It seems to me that God was sending Jacob a pretty strong message. Something like, you might be the heir, but we've got some kinks to work out before we can really make this happen. So we fast forward to the end of the first 7-year period. After working for 7 years, Jacob demands to Laban that he marry Rachel as per their agreement. And so on the wedding night, and this is kind of like the interesting plot twist, right? Laban deceives the deceiver. He gives him Rachel's older sister, Leah. And so in the morning, Jacob wakes up and he sees that he's been deceived. And he's like, oh, what gives? And Laban simply says, well, I can't give you the younger daughter first. You got to marry the older daughter before you can marry the youngest. So he demands Rachel also. And Laban says, listen, as long as you fulfill your marriage week to Leah, then you can marry Rachel too. And so after a week of marriage to Leah, he's allowed to marry Rachel as well. So at the end of 7 years, Jacob is married to both sisters, but he clearly loves Rachel and not Leah. And in fact, depending on which verse and which translation you read, Jacob either simply doesn't love her as much, or in some translations says that he outright hates her. Not a dissimilar story to Isaac loving Esau more than Jacob himself, right? History in these story elements tend to repeat themselves. Well, God does something very interesting in Genesis 29:31, right? So here we are, we're past the first 7 years. Jacob is married to both women, to both sisters. And in Genesis 29:31 says this: when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And this story element of a barren woman and then God opening the womb and providing children is also part of this patriarchal story, right? So it's important to note that God singled out Leah and blessed her while allowing the love of Jacob's life to remain barren, right? And Jacob must have been chomping at the bit. He knows he needs an heir, and I'm convinced that for the first 7 years he was thinking that his heir would come through Rachel. And maybe some of the animosity that developed between the sisters was of the same sort that plagued Sarah and Hagar. Not that they were sisters, but Hagar produced Abraham's firstborn natural son, not the son of promise that Isaac turned out to be. And maybe Rachel harbored this belief and desire to be the mother of the next heir. If Jacob shared with her sometime in that 7-year period, guess what? My family's kind of been singled out of the whole world, and God's doing this amazing thing through us, and it started with my grandfather and my father, and now it's been handed down to me, and my heir will be the heir of the covenant that will bless the entire world. I mean, that's some pretty powerful stuff, and it might set up a certain set of expectations in a young woman's mind. Well, nevertheless, with God's blessing, Leah, not Rachel, goes on to give Jacob not just his first, but his first 4 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, in that order. Now, as we continue to read, we're going to read 32 to 35 here, these verses. I want to see if you can spot the critical point that I think answers our question, why Judah? Remembering that this is before the adult sons of Jacob and Leah messed up, as we said a while ago, with Reuben sleeping with Bilhah and Simeon and Levi murdering the Shechemites, right? So in verse 32 it says this: so Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, the Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. And it was kind of the thing to do back then was to name kids according to some event or something that was going on, what was maybe important at the time. And so Reuben means affliction, right? The Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. Verse 33, then she conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, now I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she stopped bearing. So I think the answer to the question why Judah is tied up in Leah's heart, in her attitude, right? What was her first focus, or her focus with her first 3 sons, right? It was feeling sorry for herself and hoping her husband would love her because she was giving him children, right? Poor me, I'm afflicted, I'm unloved. In her mind, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi were maybe more instruments to win the love of the man who rejected her and esteemed or loved her younger sister more than she did, or more than he loved her. She wasn't looking at the boys as a gift from the Lord who opened her womb and gave her children, who clearly favored her over Rachel. But with the birth of Judah, it was different, right? Something changed in her, and she took her eyes off herself, and she realized that it was God who had given her those first 3 children, and that he deserved her praise, no matter what happened with her husband, whether his heart changed or the relationship with her sister was healed. 'None of that mattered. God was giving her children. And so, with the birth of Judah, it was different, right? Something changed in her, and she took her eyes off herself, and she realized that it was God who had given her those first 3 children, and that he deserved her praise, no matter what happened with her husband, whether his heart changed or the relationship with her sister was healed. None of that mattered. God was giving her children. And in fact, that's what the name Judah means. It means praise. And Judah, with Judah's birth, she stopped having children for the moment. She goes on to have Zebulun and Issachar down the road. Those are sons number 9 and number 10. But what about Rachel? Right, during this time that Leah is bearing 4 children, if we assume she has 1 child, say, every year, we're talking for 4 years, Rachel, and this is on top of the 7 that she waited to marry Jacob, probably expecting in her mind, we're going to get married, we're going to have kids, and my firstborn son is going to be the heir of the covenant. Right? This is probably all sitting in the back of her mind. And so for these 4 years, she's watched her sister, her rival, bearing Jacob's children. She probably couldn't stand it. And while Rachel herself had Jacob's love and she had his preference, it must have been an extremely difficult thing for her to bear, again, especially if Jacob had shared anything about what God was doing through him and whoever his own heir and his descendants would be. You know, they both, Rachel and Leah, must have known what was at stake when it came to the ultimate decision of naming the heir of the family. Now, so far, God had chosen the second born, but the first 4 had come through Leah, the unloved one who had turned her praise to God. Now let's continue in Genesis 30, and we'll see how Rachel reacted and then how Jacob reacted to what she complained about. Genesis 30 says, "Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, 'Give me children or else I die.' And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, 'Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?' So she said, 'Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I may also have children by her.' Then she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife, and Jacob went into her, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son." And this is the Bilhah who the firstborn son Reuben later would have an adulterous affair with. Now here we go again with the handmaid thing, right? So Bilhah gives Rachel 2 sons. They are Dan and Naphtali. And this kind of kicks off what in the Bible reads kind of like a competition. Like Rachel names her 2 sons through Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali, basically saying that God has judged in her favor and that she has wrestled with her sister and she has prevailed. Ha, I now have children of my own. And probably the next thought is, and Jacob loves me more than you. That's probably where she was going with that whole thing. Well, not to be outdone, Leah, because she had stopped bearing her own children, takes her handmaid Zilpah and throws her at Jacob, and he fathers Gad and Asher, which basically mean fortune and happy or happiness. Again, in time, Leah has 2 more sons, and then eventually God looks down on Rachel and maybe says, all right, I've made you wait long enough. I'm going to let you have 2 children. And she bears Jacob, Joseph, and Benjamin, who we know were his 2 favorites. Right? And we'll come back to the story of Joseph and how this fits in a little bit later, probably in a different lesson. Verse 22, Genesis 30, verse 22, skip down there. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. That means shame, right? She's taken away my shame. He's taken away my shame. So she called his name Joseph and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. And she expected not only to have Joseph, but to have another child as well. Now, if you make a couple of simple assumptions, if we assume that there was 1 son born to one of these 4 women every year, if Joseph was the 11th son, we're talking 11 years after, about 11 years. Actually, it's going to be a little bit longer than that. So it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you. And Laban said, please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Then he said, name your wages and I'll give it. So he stays another 6 years. So by the time Joseph was born, it would have been 14 years, right? Around the time, the end of the 14th year. So Jacob stays another 6 years, and he amasses a sizable fortune, lots of animals, lots of servants. In reality, if you read the story in detail, what God does is he naturally transfers Laban's wealth to Jacob as he prepares Jacob to go back home to his father's house. And God has already fulfilled 2 of the 3 things that Jacob had asked for when he was fleeing from Esau. And he said, if you'll do these things for me, then I will follow you for the rest of my life. He said, I need food, I need, safety, a place to live, some clothes, and I need peace. I need peace with my family. Well, he'd given him food and clothing and much more. The only thing that had not yet been fulfilled was to return home in peace. Now, I want to remind you of something, because we kind of teased around the edges. I don't think we have succinctly answered the question, why Judah? Well, with the birth of Judah, Leah praised God. The implication is that she acknowledged the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the one and the only true God. But can we say the same thing about Rachel? Go to Genesis 31 now. Genesis 31. Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all this wealth. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable towards him as before. Now this is after the 20 years. He's getting ready to hightail it. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field, to his flock, and said to them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable toward me as before. But the God of my father has been with me, and you know that with all my might I have served your father. Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. Skip down to verse 11. Then the angel of God spoke to me in a dream, saying, Jacob, and I said, here I am. And he said, lift your eyes now, and see, all the rams which leap on the flocks are streaked, speckled, and gray-spotted, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. And he's just recounting how he transferred his wealth and all that stuff from Laban over to Jacob. And then he says this in 13, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar, and where you made a vow to me. Now arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your family. Now notice the words of both sisters, right? This is Jacob telling his wives what God had said to him. And then the 2 sisters say this, the 2 wives. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it. Then Jacob rose and set his sons and his wives on camels. Now he's got 11 children at this point. We learn later that Rachel actually dies in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin as they're on their way to Bethlehem. Now, with these statements in 14 verses 14 to 17, it seems like both sisters have submitted to Yahweh, right? They've kind of said, well, whatever God has said, let's go ahead and do that. So in verse 18, and he carried away all his livestock and all his possessions which he had gained, his acquired livestock which he had gained in Padan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. Now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and notice this, Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. Now remember that Laban was a Syrian. This was a pagan household. So several days later, Laban finds out that they're gone. He chases them. He catches up to them in the mountains, and he accuses Jacob of stealing his daughters. It's his wives, but hey, you've stolen my daughters. You've stolen all my cattle, and you've stolen my household idols. And he's just steamed about it. And Jacob denies everything, and he pronounces judgment. He says, if you can find your household idols, then death on whomever has taken them away from you. And he didn't know that it was Rachel, his love, that actually had taken it. Now, she was sitting on the idols. They were on top of her camel's saddle, and she was sitting on top of them, and she lies, and she says that she's on her menstrual period, and that's why she couldn't stand up to greet her father, knowing that if she did, she'd be found out, and because of Jacob's pronouncement, she would have to be put to death. So here's the deal. While there is some evidence that Leah embraced Jehovah, embraced Yahweh, naming Judah praise, recognizing that he was the one who blessed her. In the midst of all her trials, there is very little to suggest that Rachel ever repented, at least in what we're given in the story. Maybe later she did, maybe before she died in childbirth. But at least with the story as it stands, she fled her father's house, having stolen his pagan idols. Rachel was embittered and angry with her sister. She was embarrassed. She was shamed. She was spiteful. And even after God had finally opened her womb and given her Joseph, she still worshiped these pagan idols. And I doubt very much that she stole these pagan idols to, sell them to get a little coin for herself, because at this point they were very rich people and she had her husband's favor. She didn't have anything that she needed or wanted that she couldn't get. So she took the idols more than likely because she was still worshiping pagan deities, and she had not recognized Jehovah or Yahweh as the only true God, the supreme authority. So let me ask the question again. Why did God choose Judah to bring about the line of the Messiah? I think God passed over all the children of Jacob's love, Rachel, because of Rachel's heart, her unrepentant heart, at least it would seem, her spiritually, her pagan heart. Let's just say it that way. Far down the line of inheritance, for sure, were the two that actually came from Rachel's womb, Joseph and Benjamin. I'm not sure that's really an issue with God anyways. God will choose whom he will choose. But I think Rachel's heart was the problem, and I think God knew better when he allowed Laban to deceive Jacob. I think that Leah was the better woman despite Jacob's feelings, because her heart responded to and turned towards God. I think the main reason that God chose Judah to bring about the Messiah is that he was the firstborn son of Jacob, with whom the mother's heart was right. Because her heart wasn't right with Reuben, it wasn't right with Simeon, it wasn't right with Levi, and I think it has less to do with the mistakes that these men made later in their life, and has more to do with the attitude and the hearts of the mothers that brought about these 12 men that became the 12 different tribes. In a sense, you could argue that Leah set the course of Judah's lineage by forgetting her own circumstances, right? Forgetting her shame, forgetting her feelings of being unloved and being afflicted, and focusing instead on God, praising him for the gift of motherhood and naming her son praise. It was a dedication of sorts, the likes of which we would see in our later story with the barren woman Hannah, who prayed for a son, saying, if you give me the son, I'll give him right back to you. And then we have all of a sudden Samuel, one of the let's say most powerful and renowned prophets of the Old Testament, a dedication of sorts. I think Judah was dedicated to God by his mother, and that's part of why God chose Judah. Now, with each of these stories of the patriarchs, we see God establishing his will and sometimes guiding events directly, like the miraculous birth of Isaac. We see him tolerating the mistakes of otherwise faithful people as they learn to walk with him in obedience and trust. Like Sarah and her Hagar Ishmael mistake, or Rebecca and her instructions to Jacob to deceive his father Isaac, if we can conclude that she wasn't told to do that. Or even Jacob's spurning of Leah, which led to her self-absorption. She later turned that around, right? But in the midst of all these mistakes, God still used Sarah to give us Isaac. He still used Isaac to give us, and Leah to give us Isaac to give us Jacob, and Jacob to give us Judah. And as we'll see next time, he used Judah, and he made plenty of mistakes himself, to give us David and to give us the Messiah ultimately. So as we close this lesson for today, right, the final point, God can use us even in the midst of our own worst mistakes, even in the midst of our self-absorption, feeling sorry for ourselves, in the midst of our imperfect timing, trying to control how and when and where God works out promises that he's made in our life. The point is, we got to get our eyes off ourselves and turn our focus to him in praise for who he is and what he's done. Because as you see through all of these different stories, and no matter which level you read the story on, whether it's just scratching the surface or going a little bit deeper into details, sometimes things just don't seem right to our natural minds, but God has everything in control. His will ultimately will win out in the end. Well, thanks for watching. We'll be back for our second lesson in Leo, and we'll talk a little bit more about the man Judah, some of the mistakes that he made as God is working out the lineage of Messiah, bringing us Leo the lion. God bless. We'll take care. We'll talk to you soon.